The ranks of anti-slavery supporters grew during the American Revolutionary era. Historian Peter Hinks tells how, in 1787, Hebron residents in Connecticut refused to let Southern slave catchers abduct a local enslaved family abandoned by their Tory masters.
I have an extraordinary story from Connecticut's Revolutionary era that I would like to recount to you this morning. In September 1787, the citizens of Hebron, Connecticut, witnessed a horrible sight. Approaching the house of the Reverend Samuel Peters, an Anglican missionary who had lived in the town until September 1774, and then fled as his loyalist sympathies threatened his personal safety there, approaching this house were 6 heavily armed men. 2 of them were appointed legal agents of Peters, who by 1787 had long lived in London, England. The other 4 were men from South Carolina who had come to take possession of Peters' slaves who now resided in that house. After dismounting from their horses and their wagon, the men forcibly entered the house, violently seized Caesar, his wife Lois, and their numerous children, and dragged them to the wagon and threw them in. On Caesar, they quickly slapped heavy and chafing irons. As one white eyewitness of the event recounted, their cries and shrieks were shocking to human nature. When the white neighbors of Caesar approached the men and asked them with what justification they seized this family, the agent's power of attorney and the deed of sale was thrust in their faces. The 6 men, weapons brandished, galloped away with their captives. The townspeople of Hebron were breathless with outrage. Shocked and stunned, they, however, soon gathered their senses and acted. A large posse of men then convened and launched an unprecedented action for 18th century Connecticut. A number of persons moved with compassion under the color of lawful authority pursued and overtook them, that is, the people who were in possession of Caesar and his family. Within 1 mile of a vessel bound to South Carolina, the pursuers retook them, brought Caesar and his family back to the place where they were taken. In a spontaneous and perilous gesture of fellowship with the enslaved, predating by more than 60 years the far more celebrated and planned rescues of the recaptured slaves Jerry in Syracuse and Thomas Sims in Boston, the citizens of Hebron boldly prevented the removal of vulnerable blacks from their community and sought to restore them to their place in it. But Caesar and Lois were not yet out of danger. Despite their rescue, and I quote here, the agents of Mr. Peters manifested a determination to sell and disperse the family, which continues to render their condition very miserable and unhappy. And they sought to re-enslave them for the following 2 years. But throughout it, the townspeople protected and fought for this family. We now know of this incident because numerous Hebronites were willingly deposed as they pursued various legal recourses to secure the freedom of Caesar and his family once and for all. By January 1789, their petitions and depositions reached the Connecticut General Assembly. In that same month, after much struggling and anxiety, Caesar, Lois, and all of their progeny were designated by the state forever free. In 1774, Hebronites and virtually every other white person in Connecticut existed in a context of near axiomatic racial understandings. Africans were absolutely inferior to Europeans and would not be viable in the colonies without firm white regulation and guidance. That they were placed in the world by God to be subject to white authority, and that slavery was thus a fit and natural condition for them. All of these assumptions, key assumptions, pervaded the thinking of whites in late colonial America, North and South. Essential to reinforcing these assumptions was the reality that for all intents and purposes, blacks nowhere in the colonies in 1774 existed as free men and women. For example, in 1770, there were about 50,000 slaves in the North, with maybe a few hundred free blacks at most scattered throughout the region. The revolution, however, would begin to undermine these assumptions and numbers at the root. But at the more ordinary, everyday level of existence, another development was unfolding during the revolution that would be every bit as important in eroding racial preconceptions as were the ideological trends. Blacks were seeking freedom, were becoming free, and were living valuable, even meritorious lives wholly outside of white supervision. Before and during the revolution, black slaves ran away by the tens of thousands, north and south. Thousands of others won freedom by enlisting in state militias or the Continental Army. Many others sought and won freedom by petitioning and suing for it. The tumult and social dislocations of the revolution provided an unprecedented opportunity for people of African descent to highlight their dedication to freedom. In the months after the flight of Peters, Caesar and Lois and their growing family continued to live and work on Peters's large estate. Yet with the full outbreak of war by 1776, the newly created state's attorney of Connecticut confiscated Peters's property as abandoned and converted it to public property to be used for the support of the state. Caesar and Lois were summarily turned out from Peters's land, and the farm was rented to white tenants. It is significant that at this particular moment, no members of white Hebron intervened to protect Caesar and secure his tenancy. The family squatted on marginal lands immediately adjacent to the Peters estate. One townsman marveled that they had, quote, supported themselves comfortably for about 5 or 6 years after 76 without any assistance from said master or his estate except the privilege of firewood. Another remarked that, quote, by good economy and close application to business, they did procure a very comfortable living for some years, unquote. All of this prevailed, the deponents indicated, until Reverend Peters's agents arrived and made it their constant practice, and I quote, made it their constant practice to vex said Negroes by threatening to sell them, unquote. By 1787, Caesar and Lois's white neighbors did not want to lose them as fellow citizens and were now willing not only to risk their security before the law, but their very lives in order to safeguard a freedom for Caesar and his family, to which they had no doubt whatsoever, a freedom that, to which they had no doubt whatsoever that the family was now entitled. This clarity on the legitimacy of black freedom simply was not present in 1776 for ordinary whites in Hebron, nor likely was it present throughout the North in myriad localities where similar struggles and dramas unfolded in communities with black slaves. By 1787, they had. And the case of Hebron provides an extraordinary occasion to view a not uncommon result of these challenges. That is, the enthusiastic embrace of African Americans as vital and constructive members of the community. These sorts of very local scenarios would never have occurred without the opportunities for black freedom presented by the profound social disruptions wrought by the American Revolution. And the role these events played in the enormous transformations in thinking about race and black freedom in late 18th century America and the Atlantic world were every bit as important as were the revolutionary ideologies attacking slavery and upholding universal human liberty and equality. Thus, as we witness the steadily expanding formal promulgation of gradual emancipation in the North, from Pennsylvania in 1780 and Connecticut and Rhode Island in 1784 through New York and New Jersey in 1799 and 1803, and thus, as we witness this first great example of state-sponsored emancipation in the history of the Atlantic world and rightly celebrate the legislators, clerics, and statesmen who brought it all to pass, we must not forget the small but significant role Caesar and Lois played in making this all possible. Thank you.